Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to this important discussion on voices of the Global South, energy security, and economic opportunity. Again, I'd like to welcome all those joining us in person as well as those joining virtually. Today's conversation is particularly timely because it's an opportunity to highlight the voices and the perspectives of policymakers and stakeholders across what is often referred to as the broader Global South. Here, it's particularly important the perspectives of the Caribbean, which is a region that is fundamental to the work of the Atlantic Council and whose challenges are particular of the Caribbean itself, but also as we'll talk about other island states globally. So I'm particularly pleased that we're joined by Jean Leon. Jean is the president of the Caribbean Development Bank. Jean has also been a great partner of all the Atlantic Council's work in the Caribbean. Jean was elected president of the CDB in 2021 and has over 30 years of experience in economic development across the Caribbean, Central Asia, Middle East, Africa, and he and the Caribbean Development Bank continue to move to hit new strides. We are also joined by an incredible other panelists. Ghana's Deputy Minister of Energy, sitting next to Jean, Herbert Krapa, who's a lawyer by training and was appointed to his current position in April of this year. Since then, he's worked with Mr. Prempeh in helping Ghana navigate the complex challenges of the global energy markets. Deputy Minister, thank you so much for joining us as well. We are also joined today by Marcelo Madrigal, who is the head of the IDB's Energy Division and the head of the Electromobility Group. Marcelino was previously the commissioner of the Regulatory Commission in Mexico, has worked across electricity sectors in Latin America. He's also a member of our the Atlantic Council's Caribbean Energy Working Group. So Marcelino, great to have you join us.
Thank you.
In the next to Marcelino, we are also joined by Senior Vice President of Strategy and Market Analysis from Aramco, Fahad Aldhubaib. Fahad, thank you so much for joining us. Fahad has previously worked as Aramco's General Manager for Public Affairs and Director of New Business Development and has years of experience as an engineer. And then rounding out our panel and seated in the middle is Pietro Sampaio Mendez. Pietro is the Secretary for Oil, Natural Gas, and Biofuels within the Ministry of Mines and Energy in Brazil. He's also chairman of Petrobras, has over 16 years of experience in the energy sector, having worked across public and private sectors. And maybe you can also give us some insight on COP30 that will be hosted in Brazil. So I want to welcome all of our panelists. Please join me in welcoming them all to the stage. I have a few thoughts to frame the conversation. I'm going to kick it off with you, Jean. What we're seeing around the world is a need of facilitating an energy transition while also maintaining energy security. Over the past few years, the world has seen dramatic success as solar and onshore wind projects have dropped in cost. Some regions, like Latin America, have an energy matrix that is heavily dependent on hydropower. And Africa is leading the way in carrying out a just transition, and we'll talk over this panel, what does actually a just transition actually mean, and what does that actually look like? But challenges persist. Shortened and disrupted supply chains, along with rising inflation, is increasing the cost of critical clean energy technologies, and geopolitics and conflicts around the world are causing oil and gas prices to become more volatile. Developing and emerging economies in the Global South are most affected by these market changes. All of this has contributed to a narrative that's dominated headlines prior to and during COP, a division on how to go about an energy transition. There's an underlying consensus the world needs to move toward cleaner energies and invest in emerging technologies to mitigate and capture carbon emissions, but how and when to do so is up for debate, especially with regard to the broader development needs of countries in the Global South, and recognizing that economic development trajectories will also mean different approaches. We've heard from leaders in the Caribbean, Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and elsewhere, that an energy transition cannot happen if it means undercutting economic growth. And we've seen this also firsthand through the work of the Atlantic Council's Caribbean Energy Working Group. So with that, let me turn to our speakers. Let me start with Jean. Gene, today is a rest day, so it's also a good day to reflect. We're all resting here as part of this rest day. Can you reflect on some of the announcements so far that you've heard as part of this COP that will have an impact on Global South energy goals, specifically in the Caribbean? And what are other announcements that you hope to see to come out of this COP?
Thank you very much, Jason, and welcome to this event. I probably, before I just touch on reflections, maybe put this in a little context, because you talk about a just transition. Just for me means the ability to achieve prosperity for all. That I think is a fundamental starting point, because if we do not start there, then we cannot understand transition to what, and why is it that the transition is just or not just. And so once you define this in terms of prosperity and not economic growth, it opens up immediately the idea that what you want is a system that talks about fair allocation of resources, access to human rights, and fair treatment of everyone. That is the foundation of a people-focused prosperity outcome that we need to be able to achieve. Now, I start there because I want to be able to make one point. Why is climate change that important, at least for the region, but I would argue for all SIDS? Because I believe we have 6 key needs at this point. A food security need, which is in fact impacted by climate change. A energy security need, also impacted by climate change. A water security need, impacted by climate change. A shelter security need, impacted by climate change. A health security need, impacted by climate change. Education security need, impacted by climate change. So you need to be able to bundle all of those together to first talk about prosperity. That's the first thing. And so, but all of them, all roads lead to climate change. And so that is, I think, the context of where COP is situated. If we are to say, did COP advance? And I was saying to Jason in the anteroom, COP for me is a process that we advance as we go along each year. And so we achieve pieces along the way. And so the question you say about reflections is, has COP advanced and advanced adequately to help us begin to say we are moving towards some degree of prosperity? And I think 2 things that are pertinent to this debate that have a reason are: 1, in the area of renewable energy. There is a discussion about tripling generation and doubling efficiency. Now, I think for that to happen, you clearly need a couple of things. One has to be finance, and the finance part was equally discussed in COP, where we know the UAE announced a 30 billion fund to start talking about global climate solutions, and the 700 million pledge for the loss and damage fund. Now, you bundle those together and you realize immediately that while it is welcome, while it is a start, the actual investment need is not 30 billion, not 700 million on loss and damage, but somewhere in the range of $20 trillion. So there is a humongous gap that is still to be filled if we are to talk about attaining prosperity.
So Gene, as we're looking at, as you said, COP, you look at as part of a process.
Yep.
So you see that announcement as maybe the important part of the process.
Important part
but
of the process.
It's the start of a much larger process.
It is the start of a much larger process, and because the gap is still so wide, it forces us to now establish how do we allocate the small amounts that have now been given, however big it is and welcome it is. How do we determine who gets the priority, and therefore who gets more prosperity? And equally, how do we continue to contribute as the process continues so that you could genuinely make a change in the lives of people.
Thank you so much. Now let me move on to your perspective from Ghana, Deputy Minister Krapa. You heard Jean's points, looking at just transition, looking at this broader COP process as having to be really much focused on what does it mean with regard to prosperity, right, and the impact on prosperity on Caribbean and other small island developing states. I'd like to get your reflection on announcements thus far made as part of the COP insofar as the impact on Global South energy goals and other announcements that you would hope to see from a Ghanaian perspective.
Well, Jason, thank you very much, and thank you. I think the Atlantic Council should be commended for this event, throwing light on the Global South and the needs of the Global South in terms of energy security, especially. I agree with Jean, essentially on the question of funding and financing the energy transition in the Global South. I think two things stand out for us, especially in Ghana and perhaps the broader continent. The commitments that have been made, the pledges that have been made. I think this conference is a stock-taking one. I think we should be very clear in the outcomes of the stock that we take and the conclusions that we arrive at in terms of the progress or the little progress that has been made so far. And we should be bold to confront the truth that the pledges and the commitments have not come through. For us in Africa, energy security issues, energy transition issues have to be just, without a doubt. And when you take that stock, we should be very clear that the pledges haven't come through. The announcements that have been made in terms of the fund, the UAE fund, and the loss and damage fund, I agree with Jean. Those are just essentially seed fund, if you want to put it that way, because the amount of financing that needs to go into remodeling energy systems and energy infrastructure across the continent, across the Global South, that's a drop in the ocean in terms of the announcements that have been made. Global demand for energy constitutes 82% in hydrocarbons. And that means that the infrastructure is modeled along those lines. IEA says that has to go down to 22% by half century for us to be able to meet our targets of net zero. So that should draw everybody's attention to the need for the investment, investment into infrastructure, investment into cleaner, more sustainable energy sources, especially for those of us in the Global South. Jean touched on what constitutes a just energy transition. I think what constitutes a just energy transition is what accords with rationale, according to the arrangements of human nature. That you're blessed with natural resources, that you take advantage of it like everybody else has to develop your country and bring prosperity to your people. If, according to our understanding of things, the way that arrangement has helped other people, we can't continue in that path because of the harm that arrangement is bringing to all of us, then we have to be candid about how we finance those who are being asked to keep their assets stranded. Because what do we contribute to the carbon emissions in Africa? 3%. But whether you are in Dakar or Nairobi or Accra or Cotonou or Lomé, you feel the effect of a changing climate. And we all have an ethical responsibility to do what we can and should to bring rising temperatures down. And we are committed to that process.
Thank you so much, Herbert. Let me move on to Pietro, Secretary Sampaio. I won't ask you about whether you're going to get 100,000 people into Berlin as we have 100,000 people here this week. But I do want to ask you about your reflections on what you've heard thus far from from Gene and Herbert, from a Ghanaian, from a Caribbean perspective on the announcements thus far, but also your perspective from a Brazilian perspective on what does a pragmatic outlook look like? What is a pragmatic outlook at managing the effects of climate change, but also ensuring energy security? How do you see that in Brazil? As what does that balance look like as you approach this COP and moving forward?
Thanks, Jason. It's a great pleasure to stay here. And for Brazil, energy transition contributes with energy security. We have a lot of experience. We produce ethanol. It's not possible, for example, when you go to the gas stations in Brazil to buy just fossil fuels, except natural gas. Because every gasoline, we have 27% of ethanol. We have 100% of ethanol, E100. We have biodiesel in all diesel. We have 12% when we are moving for 15%. Our power matrix, we have 88% comes from renewables. And the cost to produce energy in Brazil from wind and solar is lower than when we produce from natural gas. And we have natural gas thermal powers to stabilize the system, but the cost is lower. We have a huge potential in Northeast to increase the production of onshore wind. We are establishing a legal framework for offshore wind as well. And we believe that, for example, Northeast can become an exporter for all the world of green hydrogen. We have a lot of potential to produce there. We did this year a bid for transmission lines because we have an excess of renewable energy in the Northeast, and we need to export this renewable energy for the Southeast, where we have the consumption. We submit this year a program called Fuel of the Future. Brazil has the potential to produce 9 billion of sustainable aviation fuel per year. Our consumption is 7 billion of jet fuel, so we can produce more from renewables and just comes from waste. It's not for first generation biofuels, just comes from waste. We can export credits to carbon, so we are very interested that COP move forward how to regulate this market, how Brazil can export credit on carbon, We have a lot of funds here in the Middle West interest to buy this credit carbon, but we don't have the rules, so I think that is very important to move forward for this. So our expectation is that energy transition needs to go as faster as we can, and of course we will not stop the production of oil and gas. We are a huge producer, we are increasing the production. Petrobras is responsible to inject more than 30 million tons of CO2 equivalent of CO2 during the production of oil and gas, and we are establishing a legal framework for CCUS, and when we combine CCUS and, for example, ethanol production, we are able to produce ethanol with a negative liquid capture of carbon. So it's something that is very important, because when we produce ethanol, you have a fermentation process, you have a CO2 stream, you can put the CO2 stream in a reservoir. So we are very, very happy that this COP is going, and we believe that Brazil can export sustainable aviation fuel, green diesel, export green hydrogen. So this is what we believe.
And you also see in Pietro in Brazil the impact of climate change on the energy transition because of Brazil's increasing dependence on energy where climate change can impact the availability of that energy, right? Whether due to drought or other challenges that you've been experiencing firsthand in Brazil.
Yes, we are seeing that it's real that we have climate change. It's not something that's just in the papers. Well, for example, in this year in Amazon forest, we see a very dry season, and we had some problems to supply fuels, for example, inside the Amazon forest because the rivers are so low. And we believe that sometimes this is a problem for harvest, for produce crops. So we need to deal with this all the time.
I want to scale up to look at Latin America and the Caribbean writ large with Marcelino, then turn to Fahad for your analysis. But Marcelino, you've been listening to the discussion thus far. prosperity, just transition. I think one of Herbert, your important points as well is that there are pledges and commitments, but you want to see those actually come through. Marcel, let me get your perspective. And also, how are you seeing some of the differences overseeing energy issues for the Inter-American Development Bank writ large across the region, differences between how countries in Latin America and the Caribbean might be seeking to balance their energy transition versus how countries in what's oftentimes referred to in the global north are seeking to balance the transition?
Thanks a lot, Jason, and really thanks for the invitation to the IDB to this event. I have really enjoyed it so far. There are sub-regional differences and country differences in Latin America, but we cannot dive into all of those. Like Jean was very clear, the Caribbean deserves special attention because it's a different reality. But broadly, I would say that in Latin America, we have seen how an energy transition is consistent with energy security, and I will explain why. Because I really think we need to get away from the vision that energy security is about choosing renewables or fossil fuels. It's more complex than that. Energy security is about the physical aspects of it, to have enough energy today and tomorrow, the affordability aspects of it. I mean, energy needs to be affordable for the citizens, but also for governments that sometimes are strained fiscally because of the fluctuations in oil prices. And it needs to be, security is also about sustainability and resiliency, right? If we don't fight climate change, we have a security problem. But also, if we don't have an energy system that can manage the impacts we already see on the energy system on climate change, it's not going to be secure. And hydropower is one situation. Latin America average 60% clean electricity, so we cannot really triple because we're two halves way there.
The math doesn't work.
There are differences there. Some places we still need to move. But so security, and because we rely a lot on hydropower, managing now the impacts of climate change requires that we continue to integrate more. And that proved to be very useful to Brazil, to be integrated with other countries. It has proven very good to Central America, or very good to Ecuador to import energy from Colombia. On affordability, I think there is room to work because the oil price crisis episode that we had really put strain on the budgets of many governments that import and still subsidize fossil fuels. Subsidies in 2022 were $56 billion, and 2/3 of that were to fossil fuels, not to renewables. So renewables, in general, they do not need subsidies anymore in Latin America. So we on the affordability side, which is a security aspect, I think Latin America, we still need to work a little bit more. And then on the reliability side, I think we have more diversified sources of supply. There are some exceptions that depend a lot from gas from one country or the other, but I think we are more diversified. So in conclusion, I would say that examples, Costa Rica, Uruguay, 100% clean energy. When gas prices were to the roof, $40 per MBTU, they were exporting energy. And they were reducing prices internally when other countries in the world were trying to see how they manage, this price increase. So renewables is compatible with many angles of energy security, definitely. So I see that you need to be, of course, careful planning those transitions, making sure you have the tools to manage the new uncertainties, like in hydropower, integrating more, and we will need to definitely continue investing a lot, because also in Latin America, we need to triple, investments in energy to keep up with increased demand and the impacts of climate change.
But I think, Marcel, as you're saying, that diversification of the energy sector across Latin America really does differentiate the region and its approach and where it is thus far in the transition. Fahad, I want to move on to you and your perspective on what does a pragmatic outlook look like insofar as managing the effects of climate change, but also ensuring energy security.
Thank you, Jason, and good afternoon, everyone. In Aramco, as the leading energy company, we're looking at two things. How do we satisfy the increasing energy demand, and how can we make the current energy system cleaner? Let's look at the global south, where the bulk of demand is coming going forward. At the moment, 63% of the energy demand is coming from the global south, from 40% 20 years ago, heading up to 70%. This is going to happen on the back of 2.2 billion people moving to urban areas and 1.3 billion people getting into the sweet spot of $10,000 per capita, by which we see an acceleration in demand. At the moment, the GDP per capita in the global south is 7,000 on average per person, and in the global north is around 50,000 or so, 55,000. So affordability and reliability are key. We've seen on the back of the Ukraine-Russian crisis, when we lost 7% of the gas supply, prices went up by sixfold. Coal demand increased to a record of 8 tons per annum, and accordingly we've had half a gigatons of emissions on that year, which basically wiped out all of the benefits we got from renewables over the past 15 years. So we shouldn't take affordability and reliability lightly in the global south. I think because emissions are borderless, whatever we do in any country will impact us. And this is why more and more of the focus needs to be devoted to the global south, starting with Asia, Africa, and then Latin America, in terms of the growth we anticipate. As Aramco, we're in almost all forms of energy, and we're trying to look at what will be the likelihood for all of these energy supplies to meet the global demand, because basically we need everything going forward. And the time is not working in our advantage. Each country should be looked at in its own dynamics of where is the energy going? Is it for industrialization, or is it for the services sector, or is it for consumers? But the focus should be on the global south, because this is our opportunity in curtailing the potential growth in emissions we could be seeing going forward.
And I think as well, going back to maybe Gene, I'll turn to you, your point originally about prosperity, right? And so Fahad, you point out the important statistics about the growth of the global south, the demands, and also the GDP differences. And so as we look at the future of world growth, it's going to be the global south that's propelling that growth. Gene, let me turn to you for additional comments.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I want to highlight one point coming out of this in the context of just, and that is the issue of the difference between the global north and the global south. Because if we miss that, we may end up not getting to where we wish to get. And the difference is one simple word: voice. Voice. And if we do not address voice, we are not going to make progress. And I summarize the difference between the North and the South in 2 words. The first is resilience. Resilience with 2 elements. The first is the North is characterized by interconnectedness of their systems, electricity systems. The South doesn't have that. The North has resilience in their systems. The South doesn't have that. And if I focus on whether it's a Caribbean, a Africa system that are susceptible to events, whether it's climate or otherwise, the destruction of systems mean your resilience is low, and therefore your whole energy security is compounded. So that's the first difference. The second is capacity. Capacity from 2 dimensions. The first is the ability to implement new solutions the North has, whether it's because of funding, because of the ability to have subsidies. The South doesn't have that. And second is with regard to the research and development. The North has the ability to be able to promulgate those much, much faster than the South. The South doesn't do that. And so if you are to talk about voice, to allow you to talk about a just transition, we need to reverse those elements of capacity and resilience. And for me, it transits to one key point. The North has become the North because of, over time, a movement from the periphery to the center in terms of goods, wealth, control. Now you need a reversal from the center back to the periphery to normalize and to generate equity or less inequity to allow the South to literally grow. So when we talk about moving from 20% to 70% in consumption needs, how is the South going to do that in a just way? You need to have a reversal of structure, power, technology, skills, ability, financing from the center back to the periphery, which is our South. And so that question of voice, who determines the how, is a central element that we need to be discussing if we are to make progress.
Gene, I think that's an excellent way in which you accurately describe the differences between the South and North insofar as the energy systems, resilience, capacity, and the periphery versus center. I'd like to get other reflections on the panel, and Herbert as well, maybe your reflection on when we look at maybe a just energy transition, and I'd like to get your thoughts on also what does a just transition look like from a Ghanaian perspective? But what are going to be some of the immediate challenges to support that transition in an equitable way?
Thank you, Jason. I think whichever way you look at it, 600 million of the African people do not have access to electricity. Over 800 million of them do not have access to clean cooking systems. Majority of African economies do not have the capacity to support the investments into cleaner, more sustainable forms of energy generation. Majority of African countries are blessed with hydrocarbons and mineral deposits. And a just transition means taking advantage of these resources or having the capacity to finance a more diversified, sustainable approach to energy security and energy availability. In Ghana, we have developed a framework, an energy transition framework, which, with the support of the United Nations Sustainable Energy for All, we've been able to model into an investment plan. That plan, both us and the UNSC4 put the financing required to implement that plan at 650 billion United States dollars by 2060, which is the timeline for our pathway for decarbonization. And we're looking essentially at renewables, solar and wind. By 2030, our ambition is to increase our renewable mix in the energy production up to about 10%, which is some 1,070 megawatts. We're currently doing 3% of renewables in the mix. We have gas, natural gas, and that's also part of our transition fuels. And then, of course, we also have ambitions to develop a nuclear program as part of base load into the system. Of course, all of that also requires strengthening the grid. In Ghana, we have 88.86% of electricity access, one of the few countries on the continent that has above 80% of electricity access. What we have left is the island communities and the lakeside communities and those places that are quite remote, far away from the grid. And we're using the off-grid and mini-grid systems to be able to reach universal electricity access by next year, 2024. So we have a plan. We have an ambition. We understand that we have to transition, but we also have hydrocarbons. We have oil and gas in significant quantities, and we'll continue to explore that. We'll continue to develop that, and do that side by side with our transition plan to move more into renewables, solar, wind. We've done the biggest floating solar on the continent in Ghana by the Bui Power Authority, one of the two hydro generating companies that we have in Ghana. We have done 117 megawatts of solar already. by the end of this year, we're hoping to add another 200 megawatts. So we have a plan to diversify more into solar, using gas, and also bring nuclear on board. We're in the market already talking to prospective vendors for a nuclear program. But all of this will require significant financing.
Yeah.
And as we have seen, energy access, energy affordability, energy security, sustainable energy are very interconnected and very linked, and we have to look at all of them from one, dimension.
I want to pick up, Herbert, on the financing. Maybe I'm going to go to Fahad in a second, but first I want to turn to you, Marcelino, on what you're seeing, because there's a lot of innovative financing instruments that are being seen across Latin America. The Inter-American Development Bank is spearheading many of those interesting and innovative financing instruments. From your perspective, what are some of the fiscal and regulatory constraints that are being faced by countries across the region, and what are some of the strategies to overcome those constraints as we look at, moving toward a just energy transition?
Let me start with the last part, Jason. I think one part of that just transition is that the benefits are spread as wide and as equally as possible. And solar technology storage is making it possible to bring electricity to people that didn't have, because extending the grid is so expensive. That is one example. But with the energy transition, more opportunity can come and jobs, and we see that as an advantage of Latin America. We produce 40% of the copper, 30% of the lithium, have roughly 60% of the lithium reserves, and we did some numbers before, and the International Energy Agency now confirms if the world really moves to 1.5 degrees, that's a huge opportunity for Latin America, because actually this revenue from exporting minerals for the transition can surpass the revenues from oil and gas, and that means jobs, revenue. But to develop mining and many other technologies responsibly, you need the enabling conditions, the proper regulations, and that happens across many opportunity areas. Mining is one, developing mining in the right way, that communities benefit of it, that there is some industrialization on the process to create jobs. There is also a need to modernize regulations on new technologies in Latin America, like hydrogen. There is a big potential. Brazil from Ceará can compete with the Middle East to bring hydrogen to Europe, even more Chile. But there is still a regulatory institutional craft that needs to happen in many areas, including also new technologies, like electric mobility, where the region is picking up, and we need, because the region is diverse. In some set of countries, you just need institutions, rule of law, basic regulatory instruments to attract private investment in wind and solar, which the region has been successful, but those instruments need to be spread out across the region. That's level one. Level two, in some countries that they are already advanced, we need to modernize the way our markets work. As we have more renewables, we still need good price signals for more investment to come. And then the modernization for new technologies that I just said, hydrogen, electric mobility. So there are good foundations, but a lot of upstream work that also requires financing. Financing is not only for the infrastructure piece, but to develop the institutions and the regulations so that private investment can flow. So I wouldn't like to live without saying that investment is not only about the asset, but investing in those institutions, and we are doing a lot of that also at the IDB.
And also, a lot of the work that we've done, the Atlantic Council on the Caribbean specifically, is also the importance of a project pipeline and making sure that there's the investment, not just in the longer term, but also making sure that how to get that investment, the initial conceptualization and the thinking and pilot projects that are critical to the energy transition. Fahad, let me move to you. From your perspective, what do you see as some of the differences and similarities between developed and developing countries in their path to achieve a just transition? And also feel free to reflect further on what does that just transition look like, which has also been part of the discussion of the panel?
And I think one of the biggest challenges we're facing, not only in the, in the south, but even in the north, is the resilience of this energy system. As we move from a molecule world, oil and gas, to more of an electron world, the resilience will be quite challenged. And the reason is, at the moment, we have around 35 to 50 days of storage when it comes to oil or gas. However, when it comes to renewables, you only have a few hours of storage, which could jeopardize the resilience of the energy system. Not only that, this could also increase the cost of deploying renewables, because it's not just amount of the generation capacity, but the availability of the renewable is key, which will impact the cost and consequently the affordability. And the deployment of renewables going forward will be challenged by the higher cost of capital, because the margins on renewables are quite thin. With higher cost of capital, that will be a problem, not only in the south, but even in the north. And the other problem is permitting. Permitting in both the south and the north remain to be a challenge. This is why these two major issues need to be addressed, not only in the south, but even the north, for us to have all of this work together. It's going to be challenging going forward with higher cost of capital, with us rushing to deploy solutions that sometimes might not be affordable when it comes to the south, which could impact the just of all of that. Again, we shouldn't look at the global south in isolation of the north, because emissions are borderless. Whatever happens in the south will impact us all wherever we may be.
I think that also goes back to some of the points on this panel as well about the importance of the voice and the voice of the South. And that's why I'm so thrilled that as part of this incredible Global Energy Forum that we have this panel to give further voice to these different perspectives. Pietro, let me move to you. We talked about getting projects off the ground. Brazil has had some great success in getting energy projects. We're talking about pipelines and investment. Can you share some of the success that Brazil has had in initiating new energy projects? And also, to what degree do you see there being an opportunity for replication of some of these methodologies beyond Brazil?
So I think that Madrigal told us about the cost of capital. Cost of capital is a problem, just mainly for renewable projects, because we have lower margins. Of course, Brazil, in our opinion, according to international studies, it's one of the best places to make this kind of investment. But of course, the cost of capital is a problem. It's a problem in the South region. So I think the North region could help us, for example, giving us long-term contracts, because everything that comes for renewable in Brazil, who pays the bill? The consumer. We don't have public budget to finance this. So it's very important to have IDB, World Bank, to have long-term contracts to develop, for example, green hydrogen projects. This is something that's very important. I would like to talk a little about just transition, because we have a country that we are fighting every day against inequality. We have a lot of problems related to this. We have people that have problems, same as in Africa, related to clean cooking. For example, we are trying to spread LPG bottles for the country, and we have poor families that they don't have access, and they use wood. And when you substitute wood by LPG, you reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that is one of the key messages. Our enemy is the carbon, is not any technology or the pathway. We need to measure the carbon. And if you are using a technology that comes from oil and the production, you are reducing GHG, we need to substitute wood by LPG, we need to substitute diesel vehicles by natural gas that will reduce the emissions. So we have a lot of things to do, combining technology and use this experience. Brazil is leading a global biofuels alliance with US and India, and we are spreading in the Central America our experience with ethanol, because we use 27% of ethanol. We are moving forward to go to 30%. When we use ethanol in gasoline, you reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you increase the octane number of gasoline, so you can use a naphtha stream that has a lower octane number. You create jobs in our country, you equilibrate the sugar market. So we did a lot of job with India. They are moving for E20. We go to Central America to explain our experience, going to Cuba, going to Guatemala, going to Indonesia, to explain what we are doing in this industry, and we believe that we can spread this and leader this in many countries.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes, and I want to focus on these last 10 minutes, about 2 minutes per person, on opportunities for an energy transition to also be a driver of macroeconomic growth across the global South. We've touched on that a little bit. I think especially in maybe a region like Latin America and the Caribbean, the greatest inequality that we see of any region around the world. And so, how do we ensure that energy transition also, and Pietro, this goes to your point as well, also helps improve not only prosperity but also the lives of some of the people that are most affected, and doesn't further impact the inequality that we already see. I want to start with you, Gene. What from you are some of the resources and support from the global community that the Caribbean Development Bank and its members need to tie energy security with economic growth?
Clearly, the most important part has to be finance. We have, like in Latin America, an abundance of resources, whether it's geothermal, solar, wind, that can be harnessed to produce or generate power. And as we've made the point, there isn't one moment in your life, your waking life, that you do without using energy. That's a given, and therefore energy is pervasive in everything, every activity we do, and consequently tapping into reliable, affordable, and non-volatile electricity or energy generation has to be the beginning of all activity to meet that prosperity that we talk of. But the Achilles heel we have is not the availability of finance, but probably the affordability of finance. And we hear it keep coming up in terms of the cost of capital. And I'd like to put it to everyone. What good is it to have a high return, and that high return means it only yields our ultimate death, our ultimate non-existence? It cannot make sense, because we cannot be arguing that there's a higher cost to financing something in the realm of renewable energy that saves the planet, ultimately saves the planet from going over 1.5, and then say we cannot do it because the cost is too high. Why? Because the issue is, and everyone understands that, return is an exact replica of risk. Risk is the risk of our very existence. And if that risk is that we will perish, then that risk cannot be higher than investing in something that will keep you alive. And consequently, markets have this upside down. The cost of providing finance and investment to generate the existence of the planet, meaning your future risk profile will be lower because you will exist, cannot be higher than financing for some activity that will guarantee you will no longer exist in the long run. And so we have a mix of the way we are perceiving risk, the way we are perceiving return, and the whole idea of cost of capital. And that is, I think, where we need to rethink this whole idea of what's the cost of capital.
Gene, I'll say for those who are watching online, you can't see the audience necessarily, but we can. I can see the audience nodding, many people in the audience nodding their head as you were just giving that explanation of how do we really think about risk return and thinking about it in the long term rather than in the short term. Let me go to you, Herbert. When we look at energy transition as also being a potential driver of macroeconomic growth, and that also has to do with the risk return that Gene is speaking about as well. What are the particular challenges that Ghana faces ensuring that this transition also drives growth?
Well, Jason, it costs 1% on capital to develop renewable energy projects in Europe, the global north. If you come to the global south, in Africa and other places, an average of 20%. That is stark. That has to change. So the financing, the equity in the financing, the cost of capital into renewable projects has to be looked at. The technology, access to the technology, and the capacity to develop and deploy these technologies is also crucial. I think if you look at the socio-economic impact that a just transition can bring to all our people, it only makes sense that we focus on this transition. It only makes sense that we focus on a just transition to create jobs, to protect our climate for our people, protect the planet for our people. But the investment, the capital has to be patient. Financing has to be blended, more concessionary, if you like, than commercial. We have to see philanthropies coming in. We have joined in Ghana the GIAP battery energy storage systems in the hope that that can help us with the solar systems that we are deploying. So financing and the models of financing, we have to take a good look at the risk guarantees is also an important factor in terms of removing the risks to allow for investments to flow into Africa in renewables. Financing, like I said, technology, capacity to do these things. I believe no one has to tell us that we're running out of time. And the sooner that we got more actionable about the talk, the better that we can be able to move into a transitioning that impacts our people in the global south.
Thank you so much. Pietro, let me move to you. We have about 5 minutes, so I'm going to move to you, Pietro, and then to Marcelino, and then give you the last word, Fahad. Pietro, what are some of the maybe opportunities you see for skilled workers in Brazil in the oil and gas sector, thinking about, again, about macroeconomic growth, to participate in the growing clean energy sector? What are you seeing so far as opportunities for skill transfer within Brazil?
We are using the resource from natural and oil gas industry to finance energy transition in Brazil, because we have a fund, we are developing research, developing innovation, we have a social fund that we are providing money for students, for example, and we believe that most of our production are on offshore. So when offshore wind comes and goes, many of these abilities will be used by these workers. So we believe that this will happen normally when offshore wind industry develop in Brazil.
A win-win is part of a natural process. Marcelino, when you look across the Americas, how do you see transition playing into long-term economic growth?
I mentioned about the one part of the just energy transition is spreading the benefits, but let's be clear, there are also costs. And nobody wants to lose his job, right? So we need to really create the capacities for people in certain industries to go to others. We were in Trinidad, Jason, and they have one of the best records in terms of safety in the oil and in the gas industry. But hydrogen is completely different. It's a different monster. So we need to build the capacities so that people can engage in this new energy economy, because jobs is what is going to reduce inequality in the region. So financing, very important for institutions, for people, and for the projects. So we need to carefully work on bringing the skills, the research and development, and we need to maybe start thinking on how we can add more value. Brazil has been successful at creating a wind industry in-house. As the transition accelerates, I think we need to see how a region can play in the supply chains of technology. Definitely is something new, but I think we need to think about it because that will create more prosperity in the
So
region.
there's an opportunity to scale on a supply chain perspective. Fahad, what role do you see for the oil and gas industry in playing in ensuring that the energy security and also emission reduction efforts that they don't stunt economic growth?
Let me build on by answering this question on your earlier point around how much of the energy powers economic growth. I think we should be optimistic as we look at some of the numbers. Over the past 15 years, the global economy grew by 60% and emissions grew only by 20%. So we're clearly seeing more and more decoupling between economic growth and emissions, which is a very positive sign. If you calculate how much this could have cost us in terms of more energy demand, this is 1/3 of the global energy system, which is 90 million barrels of oil equivalent in a 300 million energy system. But clearly we're seeing more and more improvement and decoupling between economic growth and emissions. And a big part of all of this is demand side management. It's not about the source of fuel, but also the consumption of that energy and the emissions. As the leading energy company, we're looking at all options out there. We're investing in oil and gas to meet the growing energy demand, but we're investing in a very cost-efficient and emissions-efficient way. We have the lowest carbon intensity in our oil, around 10 kilograms per barrel of oil equivalent, where the industry is around 40. However, during this COP, we succeeded with ADNOC in building a coalition that aims to reduce the energy intensity, the methane intensity, and put targets for all of the energy producers. We're not stopping there. We're investing in hydrogen. We have a target of 2 million tons per annum by 2030. We're looking at carbon capture and sequestration, 9 million tons per annum. We're investing in renewables. We have 30% equity in a 40 gigawatt investment. And 60% of our R&D budget is going into sustainability. 50% of our 3 billion venture capital is going to sustainability. It takes everything out there for us to find the cost-effective and reliable solution for the energy system. We shouldn't be technology agnostic or fuel agnostic. The focus is on emissions, and this is what will help us continue fuel economic growth while addressing the emissions issue.
Fahad, I think that's a great way to end this conversation, which I think has been incredibly robust over the course of the last hour to touch on many critical issues that are paramount for countries across what is often referred to as the Global South and ensuring that energy transition is beneficial to the people around the world, including the Global South, and what is needed to be able to do that. So I want to again thank Caribbean Development President Jean Leon, Ghana Deputy Minister Herbert Krapa, as well as Brazil's Secretary Pietro Sampaio, IDB's Marcelina Madrigal, and Aramco's Fahad Aldhubaib for this incredible discussion over the course of the last hour. Please join me in congratulating.